Alright, we are back with a new video, and today we are once again updating the Survivor SA Power Rankings following the second batch of episodes, and as expected, there was a decent amount of movement. Now, admittedly, I feel like a lot of the top contenders are still in play. However, I feel like the people who maybe got quieter edits here and there definitely exploded quite a bit, or at least certain people at least. And I feel like other people were kind of blindsided a bit early on. But as I said last week, I felt like that was to be expected. Survivor SA is a lot more difficult to predict in terms of the edit compared to US or Australian Survivor. So obviously, I'm going to be talking about these changes in this week's ranking. But as usual, there are 17 players to talk about, and let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 17, we have the first boot from this week, and here we have Tevin. And Tevin obviously had a pretty notable downfall here, where he got a pretty massive edit in the first week, to the point where he was basically the narrator of the pre-merge trial coming into it. And for him to be taken out this early on does seem a bit shocking at the end of the day. And when you factor in how strong his position seemed to be early on and how the episode seems to highlight a lot of his strategic prowess, I mean, you'd think he would have been in a bit more contention, and especially with Dino seemingly being purpled early on. However, by episode 4 and 5, it seemed like Tevin was being set up for a downfall here. And I kind of understand the why they did it that way, in the sense that they obviously wanted to have Tevin be this big blindside where the outsiders come together and they take out this big domineering threat who is bossing people around. And I feel like Tevin very much fit that mold based on his edit here. I feel like that's slightly different from certain other cases of this type of vote happening, where usually the person will be a bit under edited in the episodes leading up, and then they suddenly get a big spike in content in their boot episode showing them being domineering. And yes, while it does explain why they're voted out, obviously it does seem to come a bit out of nowhere. But here we definitely see Tevin in the forefront early on. We see him being this big, domineering, big threat, so that when the others eventually target him, obviously we understand that he is a big threat and that he should be taken out. So I feel like this episode, and particularly Tevin's edit here, really highlights some of the differences between SA's editing style and that of other versions of Survivor, in that they're not going to necessarily shelter someone who isn't really going to be long for the game, and that if they are a big threat, that they are going to actually highlight that. So that is something to consider here. But obviously Tevin played an alright game for the most part. I mean, he definitely tried to distance himself from the rest of the season 6 members, which wasn't helped by the fact that he got a tattoo. I also think he could have done a better job at aligning with certain people, particularly people outside his archetype of hyper strategic player, people like a Dino or people like a Sheamus. So I feel like that contributed to his downfall. And then obviously him just calling like random tribe meetings where he would obviously summon the whole tribe and speak to them as a contingent, particularly when he was talking about the rumor that was spreading around about him having an idol, and he basically asked everyone to dig up the idol for them so that this rumor could be put to bed. And while he does do that, again, it also contributes to him coming off as domineering. So again, I feel like Tevin definitely had some threat perception issues, but for the most part, he was definitely a big character early on, and definitely one of the more surprising early boots. But again, that's SA for you. So because of that, he is here number 17. Now we're moving on to number 16, and we have the next boot to talk about, and here we have Sheamus. And I feel like Sheamus kind of falls in a similar trap as Tevin. Now, admittedly, I did have him a bit lower even at the time of my week 1 power ranking, as I feel like he was someone being set up with a storyline here of him being the first boot and him wanting to prove himself. And I feel like that was laid on a little thick in the first week, and obviously he got a ton of content along with Tevin of him really navigating the dynamics here. And then once Tevin goes, he's essentially on the outs, and we definitely see him attempt to like steer the ship, but by the end, I mean, it doesn't really amount to much, especially once he decides to target Dino, who he does see as a relatively big threat, which does allow Dino to flip the votes onto him. So not great at the end of the day, but similar to Tevin, I feel like Sheamus was an interesting character on the season, and I feel like he definitely had some missteps along the way, particularly with him aligning with some of the bigger strategic people. Now, mind you, I think Sheamus did a slightly better job at reaching out to other people, particularly with a Theresa and people like a Shona, for instance. However, even then, like, those bonds weren't enough to really keep him around. And similar to Tevin, he was taken out for like wanting to overplay per se. So again, it's not too surprising to see him go out here, and he's here at number 16. Now we're moving on to number 15, and we have the other boot from this week, and here we have Shona. And Shona is kind of the opposite of Tevin and Sheamus in that she was actually one of the quietest people in the edit for a lot of it. I mean, where obviously she was one of the more invisible people in the first week, and even in the second week, I mean, she did have a very quiet episode 5, but then afterwards really started to pick it up. She ends up with 11 confessionals by the end of the season, 9 of which came during this week's batch of episodes. And obviously, there's quite a bit to break down in terms of her gameplay here. Obviously, her big move per se is her choosing to go to the new Yontao tribe, despite that grouping having a 2-5 pre-merge disadvantage. So she's obviously going into a minority situation without an idol or any sort of advantage here. Now, I do understand the logic of why she did it. I mean, she talks about how she wanted to potentially make a big move and ensure that the pre-mergers come to emerge in numbers, and obviously protect Dino, someone she was very close with on the island, someone she talked about in her preseason interview about wanting to work with. And from what we saw, she was working with Dino for a lot of it. So I understand why she chose to go over there, but it still put her in a pretty bad spot. And we immediately saw a lot of the post mergers talking about targeting her, and I feel like she largely got undermined once she got onto her new tribe, where she was obviously trying to set ground rules for the group, particularly talking about how like they shouldn't search through people's bags, only for Shane to immediately search through people's bags. People talk about her being a bit annoying with some of those rules as well. And obviously, she does get injured during the challenge, and there was some doubt about her being medevaced. And then even after she comes back to camp, I mean, they're still targeting her largely for the reasons that were already put in place there. However, we do see her and Dino almost pull off a flip here of getting rid of Dante. I mean, had Phil just stuck to the plan, I mean, they probably would have gotten the numbers there. But obviously, a number of things got in the way. I mean, there's the fact that she wanted to play a fake idol, like she planted it at Tribal. I feel like that idea and the fact that Dino ended up telling Phil about that probably didn't make Phil feel super easy about the plan, made him worry that potentially with that, along with Dino having a real idol, that Phil could just be the safe out there. So I kind of understand the logic of why Shona went home here, both from a gameplay perspective and from an edit perspective. But obviously, I never really saw her as a top contender based on how quiet she was in week 1. And then even in week 2, when she was getting more content, I feel like a lot of it was negative. So because of that, she is here at number 15. And with that, there are 14 players left in the game to talk about. And as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely it is that I think they have to win the game at this point, based on their current game position, along with the edit they've gotten so far. But at number 14, the person I believe is the least likely to win the game right now is Killarney. And I feel like this stems from both a gameplay perspective and from a edit perspective, where I feel like from a gameplay perspective, she hasn't demonstrated herself to be the worst player in the world. I mean, she talks about wanting to stick with the numbers, and obviously coming into the trade swap, she had the numbers advantage, like with the pre-mergers there. However, we quickly see that position crumble when we see people like Pinet wanting to target her, and obviously a lot of the post-mergers are seriously considering that idea, to the point where the 3 post-mergers on her tribe are essentially swing votes now, where they essentially have their own plans here. And obviously that's not great for Killarney. I mean, the fact that she is being talked about as his potential target obviously does not bode well for her. I mean, her and Pinet are basically the 2 people being talked about as potential targets coming into it. I mean, Theresa has also talked about getting rid of Killarney. And in general, I feel like that doesn't bode well for her. And I feel like if the post mergers are serious about sticking with some of these pre mergers on this vote, like if Theresa's alliance that she built with Tasian really amounts to anything, then Killarney should be in a lot of danger the next time they go to Tribal. So that's not particularly great. But the main reason I have her here at the bottom is because of the remaining people in the game, she has the quietest edit. She's the only person who through 8 episodes has fewer than 10 confessionals. She only has 8 confessionals so far. And admittedly, I do think some of them are interesting. I mean, her talking about wanting to stick with the numbers, her talking about potentially want to make a move down the line. I feel like those are some things that could lead to her being a bigger character moving forward. But she's just been so quiet in the edit so far. And coupling that with her very weak week one, I feel like I can't really consider her a top contender. And with her potentially being a target the next time her tribe goes to tribal, I feel like I can't have her super high at the end of the day. Now, admittedly, I feel like Killarney is a bit more likely to win the game if she gets to the end than some other people we'll be talking about soon. However, considering her precarious position and her bad edit, I can't have her too high. She's here at number 14. Now we're moving on to number 13, and I actually considered putting this person below Killarney, as I feel like this person is not likely to win the game at all. However, they've at least gotten a bigger edit than her up to this point. But here we have Pinet, and Pinet is straight up not winning this game. I can't imagine a world where she wins a jury vote based on what we've seen from her so far. And to be fair, a lot of the reason why I do have her above Killarney is that, yes, while she's being talked about as a nuisance, I feel like once the tribe goes to tribal, I feel like they probably will vote out Killarney over Pinet, as Killarney could be seen as a bigger threat in the post-merge. However, Pinet still has gotten a largely negative edit where it's become very obvious at this point that she just hasn't learned any lessons from her last season. She is still a largely abrasive personality, someone that gets a lot on a lot of people's nerves, and through that, she's not in a very prime position. I mean, she's constantly been talked about as a potential target, like both on her original tribe and now even on her swap tribe. I don't see her being in that great of a position. And I feel like even if she gets to the end, I can't imagine her getting the respect to win a jury vote. So that makes it very hard for me to put Pinet super high. However, the main reason I do have her a spot above Killarney is that her edit has been at least a bit more consistent. I mean, she obviously had a better showing in week one. And then in week two, I feel like she has largely kept it up. Now, admittedly, she has quieted a little bit, after the swap. However, for the most part, I feel like she has had a more consistent edit than Killarney, to the point where I feel like she'll at least be a major character moving forward. Again, not necessarily one that's going to win the game, but one who's definitely going to be in it for a while. And for me, that is really enough to put her one spot higher, and she's here at number 13. Now we're moving on to number 12, and I feel like this person is kind of in a similar boat to Pinet, not in the sense that they're not likely to win the game if they get to the end. However, I do feel like this person has gotten a pretty big edit, but is also being set for a downfall here. But here we have Dante, and similar to Pinet, I don't think Dante's winning the game at this point. I know I was relatively high on him during week one, largely due to his big edit and him seeming like someone who has learned from his previous outing here and is someone who is more entrenched in the strategic game this time. However, I feel like this week has really highlighted his overconfidence and also his domineering nature, where he assumes he's running the game here. And we see that obviously with him being very vocal on his alliance, the Breakfast Club, and then especially at the post swap where he's basically dictating the vote here, telling like people like a Marion and a Merrell that Dino has to go right now over someone like a Shona, who is seen as a consensus. And through that, we definitely hear a lot of people's reactions to Dante, and I feel like that is really what sealed Dante's fate for me. We've heard people like Palessa, people like a Marion, people like a Merrell all talk about how they don't want to do what Dante is demanding, and they've talked about how Dante is this big threat who thinks he's running the game. And for me, that is such a damning thing for Dante, in the sense that I feel like he is due for a downfall sooner rather than later. Now, obviously, there was a decent chance that it could have happened in this last round where Dino put together the plan to blindside him and was one vote away from doing so, but obviously with Phil not going with the plan, Dante is still around here. But that still doesn't take away from the fact that Dante will use this as an opportunity to demand that Dino be the next target. And even if he gets his way at the next tribal and gets Dino out, I still feel like those people will be looking at Dante as a big threat. And considering, well, spoiler alert, I consider Marion, Merrell, and Palessa to be pretty serious contenders at this point to win the game, I feel like they probably will be vindicated in feeling like Dante is overly controlling and in turn tried to orchestrate the flip on him. And I wouldn't be surprised if one of those three came together and orchestrated the eventual Dante blindside. So I feel like Dante has been really undermined in the edit to the point where I feel like I can't see him winning the game. However, he has gotten the edit to where I feel like he has at least been a more major character than someone like a Killarney, but I still don't think he's winning, and he's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have someone who's pretty similar to Dante in a lot of ways. Maybe not as undermined in a direct way, but still undermined in smaller ways. But here we have Dino. And I also do not think Dino's winning the game at this point. While he has gotten a pretty big edit in this last week, I can't ignore the fact of how invisible he was in the first week. I feel like even if he wasn't super relevant in the dynamics during the first week, that he would have not gone 2 episodes in a row without a confessional here. And even this week where we see him like navigating the swap and him navigating being in the minority here, I feel like he is being like undermined to a degree. I mean, obviously there's the moment where he plays his idol at Tribal and we hear Nico kind of scolding him, telling him, "Oh, we're gonna play it." And then even afterwards, like he takes a while to sit down, makes it seem like he's making this big mistake. And obviously when that's followed up with the plan falling apart, I feel like that's just a really bad look at the end of the day. And something I noticed is that this isn't even the first time something like that happened. I noticed how in episode 4, when he burned his fingers and he showed them off to Nico at the next challenge, I feel like even then Nico was, again, not being super sympathetic to him. And the fact that they left that in the edit, the fact that it was this weird kind of dodo moment for Dino, I mean, I feel like that is not a good sign at all. And the edit just has just these weird moments where despite Dino getting all these confessionals talking about his strategy, I mean, I don't feel like it is really something that translates to a win for me. And if we look at his game position right now, it's obviously pretty bad. I mean, Dante has been gunning for him all this time. We just saw him try and fail to blindside Dante. And at this point, he's in a pretty bad situation. He's down 5-2. I mean, they can't even split the vote unless they get Palessa on their side. And even then, like, he doesn't have an idol. There may be a search for an idol. Maybe he can get another idol. But I feel like if we're just looking at short-term position, Dino's probably in more danger of going home next than Dante. Though I can see a world where Dino is able to get the numbers together and pull off the Dante blindside. I mean, we do hear Marion and Merrell talking about wanting to work with him, how they didn't want to write his name down over Shona, though now with Shona gone, that kind of makes that buffer like not present for Dino. And even after that, I still feel like Dino will be perceived as a big threat later on. I can't really see him winning the game, and considering like how weird his edit has been to this point, I can't justify him being a top contender for me. So like Dante, I feel like he's kind of belongs in this tier of players who probably aren't going to win and are probably going to be set up for a downfall sooner rather than later. But considering like the flaws aren't as blatant as someone like a Pinty or a Dante, I feel like 11 is a good spot for him. Now we're moving on to number 10, and we have such a weird player to talk about, particularly with their edit. And here we have Phil. And this has been such a weird edit for Phil so far, where his week 1 was very, very bad, in my opinion. Again, similar to Dino, had 2 episodes in a row without any confessionals. And that wasn't great. And that was a big reason that I had him this low on my week 1 power ranking. But then obviously week 2 rolls around and he goes from being one of the lowest confessional getters to one of the highest confessional getters by the end of the week, having 22 confessionals in these last 4 episodes alone, which is pretty insane if you think about it. And we do learn more about his relationships. I mean, we obviously learned that he has a very strong relationship with Felix. I mean, that was kind of shown to a degree in week 1, but now it really becomes center attention. He is obviously a pretty key figure in the Tevin blindside early on, and at the swap, he's obviously given a pretty bad swap there, but ultimately like decides to work with Dino, and it seemed like the plan was going to work to blindside Dante there, but then he single-handedly messes it up. And it's never really explained in the episode, or at least not before the tribal, why Phil decides to like vote out Shona here. I mean, I kind of get that like Shona was closer to Dino than he was to her, and also like with Shona potentially pulling out the fake idol and Dino having the real idol, the fact that Dino told Phil about Shona's fake idol, I mean, I can kind of see him thinking that if both those idols came out, that like he would think he would be the safe vote there from the post mergers, because why would they vote for Dino and Shona when they could just throw all their votes onto Phil, the one person without an idol? But it is still a really terrible move of his to vote out Shona here, especially in a spot where he was already in the minority and now he just lost like a fellow pre-merger, and now he is back to being down 2-5. I mean, even if they get an idol, like it won't be enough on their own to split it. They would need to keep Palessa on their side while also getting someone else, maybe like a Marion or a Merrell. And it's certainly doable for like that grouping there, but it's obviously a lot more tricky now, especially now with Marion and Merrell maybe being more receptive to listening to Dino, to Dante, and targeting Dino. I just find this move to be really baffling at the end of the day. And the fact that they don't really explain it more, and the fact that Phil like doesn't get to explain how this move could potentially be bad for him before the tribal, just really makes this edit even stranger in my personal opinion. So at the end of the day, I'm not really sure what to make of Phil's edit. I mean, it's such a confusing up and down edit that I can't really say whether he's a contender or not. And I feel like him, along with several other people, are kind of in a similar ballpark. Now, I don't think he's dead. I don't think he's being set up for a downfall per se anytime soon. However, considering how strange his edit has been, I can't have him too much higher than this. So he's here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have someone who's a bit more consistent in the edit than Phil, and is someone who is in a better game position at the moment than Phil as well. But I'm just not sure what to make of his edit. But here we have Felix. And again, Felix has definitely been on the quieter side in terms of the edit, and plus he's had episodes with 0 confessionals. Specifically, episodes 3 and episode 6 are 0 confessional episodes for him, which isn't great at the end of the day. And I feel like even some of the confessionals he's gotten so far have not really led to much. I mean, I obviously in week 1 we saw him attempting to get Tevin to use the outpost idol on Dante, only for that to go nowhere. We saw in episode 4 his conversation with Phil about, again, Sheamus' idol. And while that does eventually amount to something with obviously them targeting Sheamus at a future tribal, I feel like Phil gets more of the credit there than Felix does. And now, even at the post swap, we see him being included in this majority alliance with Theresa, Tasian, and Tony. But even then, he gets a confessional about how Theresa didn't tell him about the alliance, like, and how he wanted to work with Steffy more. Which, again, considering how quiet he's been in the edit, I mean, this is the first time we're really hearing about his connection to Steffy and wanting to work with her. So I feel like it's an edit that makes me a little weird at the end of the day. Again, I can't really see Felix winning per se. However, considering his game position and the fact that he's at least had some content here and there that could lead to him making a deep run, I feel like that is enough for Felix to be one spot higher. Though realistically, I don't see him as a top contender right now. He's here at number 9. Now we're moving on to number 8, and we have someone who's kind of similar to Felix in the sense that I feel like they are in an okay game position, probably a bit too quiet in the edit, although I feel like he's slightly more prominent here. But here we have Shane, and I feel like Shane has really not gotten any boost from this edit so far, where obviously his week 1, I mean, it was okay, I guess, but it didn't really amount too much at the end of the day. But his week 2 was really bad. I mean, he obviously had 0 confessionals in episodes 5 and 6, and only getting 1 confessional each in 7 and 8. So he's still pretty low on the confessional count overall, though he has technically gotten more confessionals than Felix up to this point. However, I do feel like Shane's confessionals have been a bit more substantive and a bit more positive than someone like a Felix. I mean, he's obviously gotten the storyline with Marion, and I feel like through Marion, he's in the majority alliance, and obviously that's a relatively big boom for Shane. The fact that he is in with a lot of the post-mergers right now, and I can't really see him going anytime soon per se. But as I talked about in week 1, I feel like so much of his story is wrapped around him working with Marion and his relationship with Marion. And I feel like Marion has been propped up way more in the edit than he has. So I could see Shane just falling by the wayside here, and he doesn't really have much setup for an arc beyond Marion. If Marion were to be taken out, I'm not really sure where his storyline would go here. So because of that, I can't have him too much higher than this, though I do feel like he has some longevity, and he's here at number 8. Now we're moving on to number 7, and we have someone who has been given a little bit more to do, and I actually considered putting this person above the next person on this list. However, I still feel like they're a bit quiet in the edit, but here we have Tasian. And again, the main thing going for Tasian is that he has had a confessional, at least one, in every single episode. And that trend continued in week 2, where again, he got one confessional in episode 5, 2 in episode 6, 3 in episode 7, and then 2 in episode 8. Again, he's continued to get the streak. Now, admittedly, some of these confessionals are kind of nothing. I mean, I noticed how in 2 separate episodes, he got a confessional talking about how good the reward is, which is pretty much a nothing confessional. So the fact that he got stuff like that isn't too great at the end of the day, but again, it's the fact that he's at least being checked up upon, and the fact that he's getting some consistency is something at least. This week also highlighted his relationship with Tony, sort of the up and down relationship he has with Tony. And again, I mean, it was expected that he'd be working with Tony coming into the season. It has largely panned out, though he is obviously considered turning on her, considering that she was sort of a sinking ship, at least before the swap. But now in the swap, he's obviously still with her, and through that, he is basically recommitted to working with her. And obviously, that was solidified when Theresa approached him to join their alliance. He's obviously now part of that. He's also part of the post-merge contingent that people like Killarney are talking about in terms of targeting Pinty. So I feel like Tasian definitely got a decent swap here, despite being down the numbers, at least upon original try numbers. He actually came out of this in a pretty good spot, and I feel like he should be safe for a decent amount of time. I mean, I don't really feel like anyone's talking about him too much as a threat, and despite me thinking that he could have been collateral damage for taking out like a Tony or a PK early on, it seems like that fear has also kind of subsided for someone like Tasian. At this point, like, he should be pretty good for the merge, and considering that he has gotten at least some checkups, and the fact that he has gotten at least some strategic content now that he's being a bit more relevant in the story, I feel like that could lead to something with Tasian here becoming a bigger player in the post-merge. However, considering the fact that he is still pretty quiet in the edit, the fact that he hasn't had too many relationships set up outside of his one with Tony, and considering the fact that he isn't in the driver's seat of everything, I can't have him too much higher than this spot, but I feel like he's pretty good, and he's here at number 7. Now we're moving on to number 6, and I can see some people claiming this person is too high. And to be fair, I was very conflicted about where to put this person, as I alluded to in the previous spot. But however, I feel like this person does have enough going on to where they could be a contender. But here we have Tony. And Tony has been a very conflicting figure for me in terms of watching her in the season, because she has been established as a pretty emotional player at this point. I mean, multiple players have talked about it. And despite me questioning whether certain moves that are being called emotional are actually emotional, I feel like by the end of it, she has demonstrated herself to be a largely like loudmouth in terms of her talking about the game. And I feel like that's not great. I mean, she was obviously at the bottom of the post-merge tribe, would have been in a lot of danger had they gone to another tribal. And obviously we have the storyline of her being swapped, her wanting a swap, and her now using this opportunity to continue in the game. And she does seem to be in a good enough spot right now. I mean, no one seems to be targeting her. She obviously is in the alliance with Theresa and Felix along with Tasian. And I think Tony should be in a good spot moving forward. Now, I feel like a lot of her actual winner contention will come down to how seriously do we take this storyline of her being an emotional player. Will this amount to her making a big mistake? Will it amount to her being perceived as a big threat? Will it lead to her being dragged to the end as a goat? I'm not entirely sure what any of this will lead to, and I feel like that's a big reason why I consider putting Tony lower than this. And to be fair, even now as I'm recording this, I feel like there is a part of me that feels like she should be lower on the list, and that maybe she is being set up for a downfall at some point. However, I just feel like there's enough potential there. There's enough positivity in her edit. I mean, to where despite there being some negativity here and there could be a sliver of a winner edit for Tony. So because of that, I do have her here at number 6. Now we're moving on to number 5, and as I said last week, I can't believe this person is this high. However, I feel like it's kind of the case right now. But here we have Theresa, and I feel like Theresa has continued to get some consistent content here and there. I mean, she has at least one confessional in every episode to this point, and she's in a pretty decent spot on her post-swap tribe, where she obviously gets a lot of the credit for building this new alliance of her, Felix, Tasian, and Tony. And obviously, she's gotten plenty of positive content. She seems to be a lot more relaxed and lighthearted than she was the last time. And I feel like that does indicate that she has changed for the better here in a lot of ways. Now, even so, I do question whether this will actually be a winner's edit. As again, there was that moment in week 1 where she literally spread the rumor about Tevin having an idol that led to Tevin asking the tribe to search for the idol. And again, that's not great on Theresa, and really, again, felt like a mistake she would have made on her last season. But even this week, I mean, even though we see her build this alliance in the post swap, I mean, for one, I mean, her relationship with Felix is never really established, which I think is a bit of a knock there. But also, we literally have Felix have this confessional about how Theresa didn't tell him ahead of time about this alliance and that he would have rather wanted to keep Steffy around. And for me, that was just a weird thing to include in the edit. However, I do think those things point to Theresa, again, having some cracks in her gameplay and cracks that could eventually be exploited and could lead to trouble down the road. Now, will they per se? I mean, if I had to guess, probably yes, but even then, again, it's sort of a weird thing for me to consider here. But considering the fact that Theresa does seem to be playing the game more actively, considering the fact that she does at least seem to be having a bit more success, and considering the fact that she has gotten a relatively consistent presence in the edit so far, do make me put her a bit higher on this list, though it's those knocks here and there that do make me question whether she's a true contender and whether she will have an eventual downfall. So because of that, I do have her here at number 5. Now we're moving on to number 4, and for me, this is the definitive top 4, and kind of similar to last week, all these top contenders are post-mergers. Again, I feel like the post-merge really has a lot of the top contenders in my eyes, and it's just a matter of the order. But at number 4, we actually have someone who I didn't have at the very top of this list last week, but who has moved up to a degree, and here we have Palessa. And again, I feel like Palessa does have a story here for a potential win. Again, she has gotten a pretty consistent edit for the most part. Now, she did have a zero confessional episode in episode 6, but considering, again, that was right before the swap, I don't count that too much against her at the end of the day. However, I still think she has a lot of potential storylines for her to be this underdog that eventually wins. I mean, she doesn't seem to be too prominent in the edit. Again, she's getting this consistent content without being overshadowed, so there's that. She definitely has some potential to be a big player, particularly with her being approached by Dino and being open to blindside Dante at this tribal. And while that doesn't ultimately work out, I do feel like she has this storyline of her eventually becoming this big player. So I feel like that is a big thing you can give to Palessa there. She's obviously someone who has kind of gone past the initial stages of the season 6 people being targeted. And considering that was a pretty big concern I had for her early on, the fact that she got past that is a pretty good sign at the end of the day. And again, I feel like she is someone who could surprise us and really jump out as this big player later on. Alternatively, she could just be the scrappy underdog who, again, it remains at the bottom for a lot of the game, maybe goes on an immunity run, but it is eventually taken out. So it's not as if she's this perfect winner contender by any means. However, I feel like she's gotten pretty strong content up to this point, and I could definitely see her going on a pretty big run here. So because of that, I do have her here at number 4. Now we're moving on to number 3, and believe it or not, it's the same top 3 as last week. It's just a matter of the order. But here at number 3, we actually have Steffy. And yes, I do have her here back at number 3 this week. Now, admittedly, I was a bit underwhelmed by Steffy's week here, where she definitely seemed to fade a bit into the background. I mean, it's not as if she, again, hasn't gotten some content here and there. Again, she has gotten content on episodes 5, 6, 7, and 8, one confessional in each of those. So it's not as if she hasn't gotten any content. And even now, she does seem to be in a pretty good position moving forward. I wouldn't be surprised if she made the merge here. So again, there is some merit to her game here. However, I do feel like the top two have gotten stronger content over this batch of episodes that do make me hold back on Steffy to a degree. So because of that, I do have to leave her here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and we have another player who I've been largely impressed by, both by their gameplay but also their edit. And here we have Marion. Again, she's back here at number 2. And admittedly, I do feel like she has the flashiest edit so far. I feel like she has gotten very consistent content, very positive content, and she does seem to be playing a very strong game here. She obviously got content in the post swap of her really liking Dino and not wanting to listen to Dante. And then by the end of it, like, she obviously sticks to the plan here of splitting the votes onto Dino and Shona. And obviously Dante has this whole spiel about how they should have listened to him and how Dino is this big threat. However, honestly, I don't really feel like that reflects too poorly on Marion and Merrell per se. I feel like that more so just highlights Dante's overconfidence. And yes, while they could eventually like agree to vote out Dino to placate Dante, I feel like it also will contribute to Marion being a key figure in blindsiding Dante. And I feel like that is such a big boon for her, the fact that Dante is being set up as this big, overconfident threat. And I feel like Marion, in turn, is getting seeds of her eventually being the one to take him out. So I feel like there's that. And I feel like Marion, if this were Survivor US, I feel like she would have the pretty clear winner edit right now. However, even then, as I talked about with certain other people, I feel like her edit is a bit too blatant. I mean, I do very much question whether she is the winner. I feel like right now she is very much in the Omer spot from Survivor 42 of this person who has gotten a largely picture perfect edit. However, is SA really going to make it that obvious? And I don't think they will. I mean, I don't think they're going to give Marion this massive of an edit if she were the winner per se. However, I do feel like she'll be in it for the long haul. And who knows, maybe she will come out on top and she'll surprise me. But considering those doubts I have about whether her edit is too blatant, I do have to leave her here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Survivor SA, Return of the Outcasts right now, is Merrell, the same person I had here last week. Now, the main knock I do have against Merrell this week is the fact that her episode 8, no confessionals. I do think that is a bit of a worry for me, and I could see Merrell dropping here as well. However, I feel like Merrell is someone who is clearly closely attached to Marion, someone who I feel like has been getting a lot of the positives of Marion. I mean, she's gotten strategic content here and there. She's got to talk about how Tony's a bad liar and recognizes there's more to her like story, like when she went to the outpost to meet with the pre-mergers, then she's laying on, which is true. I mean, Tony was leaking all their information to the pre-mergers, so there's that. She obviously gets to break down the various dynamics right before the swap. I mean, how the post mergers are divided. And I do feel like that kind of plays out in this first round, where we obviously see people like a Dante like imposing his will onto her along with Marion, and they have some serious disagreement over who the target should be. And yes, she does eventually give in and agree to vote out Shona. However, again, I feel like similar to Marion, she is getting set up to eventually turning on Dante. Now, whether she'll keep Dino around to allow this to happen remains to be seen. However, I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like Merrell is someone who has a lot of the positives that Marion does. I mean, mostly consistent content. I mean, pretty good game position, has shown herself to be a pretty competent player for the most part. However, without the worry of someone like a Marion being too blatant in the edit, I feel like Merrell is just under the radar enough to where she could eventually emerge as a big player if Marion were to be taken out. So I feel like that's a big reason I do have Merrell over Marion. And yes, while there are certainly other people who could take that spot as well,
I feel like Merrell is the most plausible in my eyes right now. So because of that, I do have her here at number 1.
And there we go. That will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps out with the channel. Obviously, I'll be back again next week in order to update the power rankings once again, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, Big Brother 24 is happening right now. Obviously, I'm covering that on my channel, so stay tuned for those updates as well. And also, if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server. I'll leave a link to join the description. And again, there's a lot going on. I mean, this has been a really great season of Survivor so far. I'm very excited to see what will happen next, and I hope you guys will enjoy the ride along with me. But for now, that is the video. See ya.